Hello and welcome back to Architecture Academy. In the last video, I gave you an overview of the basics of Minecraft building. Today, I want to talk more about one of those basics, depth. Depth is what sets Minecraft building aside from pixel art. The fact that we're working with a 3D space opens up so much potential for us to add engagement. What I love about building in Minecraft as opposed to doing standard art is that it has depth we're able to interact with in-game. We can make adventure maps, or lobbies to hang out with friends, or even just a nice survival base to come home to after a long day of mining. I don't know about you guys, but I'm captivated by the appeal of getting to enjoy my own work in this 3D space. Alright, so that's why depth is so incredible, but what exactly does it look like in a build? Well, as I mentioned earlier, depth is sort of the 3D-ness of a build. We can see it when there's variation in distance from front to back and side to side. The easiest way to see it, though, is on a simple wall. This wall on the left has minimal depth. All the depth in it comes from having panes instead of glass blocks, and the door is pushed back one. This is something we looked at in the first episode as well. What we didn't look at in that episode is this example on the right, which is what happens when we start to add more depth. You can see that this property alone, no texturing, no decoration, no frills, makes the wall look a lot nicer. If we move on to these houses, it becomes abundantly clear, I think, that the one on the right is better than the one on the left. Maybe you've noticed by now that I didn't ever push my walls in the first episode, even when I did this time-lapse build at the end. But it still doesn't look bad, at least I hope we can agree on that. The reason for that is because there are actually two kinds of depth. The left wall here is similar to what I did in that village. I use what I would call external depth. External depth is when our depth starts outside the build and goes inward towards the wall. So this balcony, these window frames, little eaves over the windows, these are all examples of external depth. Internal depth is what we have on this wall, where we've pushed the wall in and put our decorations inside the frame. So our depth goes from inside the build and pushes outward towards the frame. So which looks better? Well, for this example, I think they're about the same. The question then is, when should we use which type of depth and why? To answer that, we'll have to examine the pros and cons of each. External depth will use more space on the outside, obviously. I find that this can bring a lot more life to your streets and general outer aesthetic though. It also gets you in good habits when it comes to making your builds dynamic and interesting. This is because the external decorations will help you to flesh out the overall shape of your houses and how they fit into a larger context. Take this house from the village as an example. One of the external decorations in it is this balcony that goes around half of the outer wall. The idea to add that really ended up giving this building more character than it would have had otherwise. The reason that I used external depth for this entire village was because I wanted these crowded streets and houses with a lot of character and a busy and messy story to tell. On the other hand, this is a village I made a while back for an adventure map where it was important that each shop NPC had a distinct building without having giant tacky signs letting players know which was which. I used internal depth to keep them separate and give each building its own distinct uniqueness. You'll notice to this effect I also use various different colors and styles, but more on that in later videos. So internal depth is generally better for standalone builds where the house itself is the focus, not the overall build. It's good when you want to emphasize the frame, if you want lush decorations or a clean look. I imagine a lot of you will prefer this style. It is a fantastic style as a beginner builder as well to quickly adjust to the concept of depth, as the decorations you'll be using are more about interesting micro shapes than they are about function, so you can play around with it a lot more freely. I used to build primarily in this style, but I found that when I started to make diagonal builds, it was no longer conducive to how messy and misshapen those can become. If you want to see some fantastic small-scale builds in this style though, look no further than Portuguese builder Phelps builds, whose clean and polished shapes as well as texturing are top-notch. Before we move on though, one last issue with internal depth that I want to mention is that all that space that you save on the outside does have a cost on the inside. If we look at these houses again, you'll see the left one has a lot of space inside, whereas this right one has almost none. This diagram, which you may have noticed before, was something small that I built to illustrate this issue. The white wool represents the livable space for external, contrasted with internal depth builds of the same dimensions. It goes from 35 blocks of space to 15, so just by pushing walls in one, you've lost over half your space. If you're interested in doing interior designs, be wary of when you build in this style. Alright, so what's the next step? What about combining these concepts? You can, and certainly should, though it will be more challenging the smaller your build is. In mega builds, however, when the frames and shapes are as large as they are, you'll find yourself using a mix of these constantly, to the point where I wouldn't differentiate it into internal and external anymore, and just call it depth instead. If you wanted to see an example of that, I've got good news for you. I made another build for this video to try to show off the concept of depth a bit more, while also keeping the build fairly simple. Before we jump into that though, just a quick plug. These videos really do take longer than you think to make, especially when I'm making these giant builds for each episode, so if you like the content and you want to support me, it is a huge deal if you can subscribe or just leave a like and comment. I'd appreciate it a ton. Thank you, and let's get into this build.